Dear friends, hi. My name is Anna Sternsches. I'm Holocaust professor of Yiddish Studies and director of the Antennenbaum Center for Jewish Studies here at the University of Toronto. And I cannot be happier to welcome you all to our new academic year. And oh my goodness, what an event we have today prepared for you. So I am not introducing the event formally. My colleague, Professor Jim Retallick, will do it in a second. But I just want to say that it is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you all here to celebrate Doris Bergen's groundbreaking book. You will hear all about this today. It is not every day one reads a piece of scholarship that literally breaks the field, opens new grounds for research, and changes and challenges almost everything we know about history of Holocaust, Nazi Germany, and in fact, Wehrmacht army. So I will let Jim to formally introduce our event today. I'll go put my intellectual hat on in a second, but please enjoy and welcome.
Can everybody hear me? For me, it's a great honor as well to moderate this session for my dear friend and longtime colleague and interlocutor and supporter and many other things, Doris Bergen. I work on Germany and European history before 1918, so I have no intellectual investment or street cred in the subject of today, but I'm going to do my best to moderate as one should moderate. And to do that, I'm going to acknowledge two things. One is that this is an event that is supported in part by the Elizabeth and Tony Comper Holocaust Education Fund. And secondly, as we start most of our events here at the University of Toronto, we want to acknowledge this land on which the university operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're very grateful to have the chance to work on this land. So I'm not going to say anything about the book. I'm simply going to introduce our panelists and try to, although I'm sorry some of you can't even see me, do the best to moderate the discussion after the comments. If I listed all the credentials of the people here on the front panel, we would be here till midnight. So in very abbreviated form, let me go in the order in which people are going to speak. Well, first of all, our guest of honor, our honoree herself is Doris Bergen. Most of you know Doris by reputation, and maybe most of you know her personally as well. The Chancellor and Rosen Ray Wolf Professor of Holocaust Studies, well known by her previous books, Twisted Cross, the German Christian Movement in the Third Reich, 1996, and War and Genocide. I envy Doris her royalties. A concise history of the Holocaust, 2003, which I think is going into its fourth edition. Her current projects include a fascinating study of the Volksdeutsch and the ethnic Germans of Eastern Europe during World War II, but you're going to hear more about the subject and the project that she just finished. And then in order, our first speaker is Belinda David, also an old friend, going way back, professor of history at Rutgers University, and author or co-author of 6 books, including the co-edited Social Movements After '68, Selves and Solidarities in West Germany and Beyond, came out in 2022, and The Internal Life of Politics, Extra-Parliamentary Opposition in West Germany, 1962 to 1983, forthcoming with Cambridge. In fact, most of our panel seem to have forthcoming works, so we're celebrating the future as well as the very recent past. From 2018 to 2022, Belinda directed the Rutgers Center for European Studies. So again, briefly, Jenny Feller is Assistant Professor of Religion and Jewish Studies at the University of Florida, our second speaker. He's the author of The Jewish Imperial Imagination, Leo Beck and German Jewish Thought, which will be published with Cambridge University Press this October. Also won the Jordan Schnitzler First Book Publication Award of the Association for Jewish Studies. Third, Anna Sternschus, another dear friend from way back. One of the greatest things that I ever did in my 37 years at the University of Toronto was to hire Anna. And I never let her forget it. But she is, as you know, not only director of the center, but the Al and Malka Green Professor of Yiddish Studies and director of this center. She's the author of Soviet and Kosher, Jewish Popular Culture in the Soviet Union, published in 2006, not too long after she joined us. And when Sonia, I love this title, When Sonia Met Boris, An Oral History of Jewish Life Under Stalin. More recently, the public intellectual, Hollywood performer, Anna has been co-creator and director of the Grammy-nominated Yiddish Glory Project, which I'm sure many of you know, initiative that brought back to life forgotten Yiddish music written during the Holocaust and in the Soviet Union. So we have a star-studded panelist lineup here for you, and we're going to start with comments. I believe people have been asked to speak for sort of 12 to 15 minutes each. And then we will later hear from Doris and field questions from the audience. So thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Belinda.
I'm going to share the podium with this other computer. Oh, thank you, Constance. Okay. I wanted to start out with an anecdote from just this morning. Doris and I were on the subway, unnecessary normally for Doris, but she was characteristically doing me a favor because of a bad ankle. And we ran into a former undergraduate whose face lit up when she saw Doris. No surprise there, we all feel that way. She noted to Doris that she was a hard sciences student, but had taken a course with Doris in her first year as her one humanities course. And it had been so important, and she had not only gotten so much out of it, but also felt so included and appreciated that she vowed to always squeeze in at least one humanities course every year after that. But she confided, none had matched the one she took her first year, and she really wanted Doris to know that. I mention this not only because it seems never more important than now to recognize and appreciate the truly wonderful people, the Mensches in our life, but also because this characteristic, her Menschkeit, so clearly marks her important new book. I want to speak here especially to her methodological achievements, which I think are enormous and makes the book worthy of such wide readership, and which are founded not only on her scholarly brilliance, but also very much on her humanity, which shines through the study of religion and violence. This is the impetus to her beautiful integrated history, to her arguments concerning the role of witnesses, as well as one based on the most incisive readings of institutional documents and also oral histories, memoirs, and photographs. This integrated history serves not only to, it serves to not re-perform the violence of erasure of victims' voices. And this she does magnificently. So she insists on having the voices of the Jewish victims in this book on German military chaplains. Her ability to dig out Yiddish songs, knowledge of the city of Bila Tserkva, or White Church, known to Jews as Black Rot, to describe experiences at a Passover Seder in 1944 Ushharod under the new German occupiers, to memories of Jewish children who survived by crawling out from under dead bodies that had hidden them in the pits into which they were shot. All while studying these witnesses, thereby absolutely ensuring that the victims also had a voice in this story, as difficult as that was to draw out. It was Jewish sources, moreover, that allowed her to illuminate the variability of affect of, for example, Christian French people toward their German occupiers. It was such sources that give us a sense of Jewish life in Zhytomyr and not just of Jewish deaths. Doris draws on Michel Trouillot in this work, and I think she does so in more than ways than one. She notes Trouillot's mention of the invisibility of power, but she also follows him in describing the violence of the archive, how official and other archives erase the voices of many, a voice Doris helps to reconstitute. This is an integrated history, as she calls it, also in the variety of sources. Reading oral histories and memoirs. This is not only a history contemporary to 1941, nor even 39 to 45, but also through subsequent decades as chaplains work to rewrite their narrative, their, quote, selective narration, unquote, in an effort to tell a, quote, story of Christian heroism, unquote, one Doris resolutely refuses to let stand. She demonstrates rather through even these self-lionizing sources that they were, as so many proudly claimed at the time, soldiers in service of their country, eager to demonstrate and defend their role through their, quote, compensatory compliance, unquote, as she so chillingly puts it. And indeed, contemporary obituaries were retroactively unmerciful in making plain many chaplains' long-standing enthusiasm for Nazism, their anti-Semitism, their interest in a de-Judified Christianity, and as she clearly shows us in the perquisites, their positions provided, even in the absence of enthusiasm, but willingness to take on these roles all the same. Here, moreover, we also see the voices of Red Army commissars, Ukrainian families, and others who helped disrupt the narratives played out by German sources. Photos are also a critical piece of this integrated source base, allowing her prima facie to challenge chaplains and other Wehrmacht members' later claims of having had nothing to do with atrocities, to read the faces gathered to watch public executions, the face of a German chaplain performing a rite meant to sanctify the gift of faith that Germans gave Ukrainian women and children, and of a Jewish girl wearing a cross at her confirmation, a sign, Doris observes, of both her protection and her erasure. Doris also does beautiful work weaving together and integrating once more forms of history often left siloed. For example, institutional history of both churches and state, allowing her to reveal that religious leaders too committed to Nazi ideology were unlikely to be chosen as chaplains, and at the same time to draw differences and surprising similarities in the experience of Protestant and Catholic chaplains, although the Catholic Church was generally understood to be in a somewhat more guarded position vis-a-vis the Nazi leadership, to analysis of rhetoric and practices of speech, including Christian parables meant to serve the war effort, from a study of masculinity to uncovering the self-proclaimed disempowered numbness that conveniently permitted these chaplains to watch as Jews were being beaten, shot, and hung, and through forms of habit and path dependency that made their jobs often ever easier to bear, alongside the rewards and opportunities the jobs provided them. Doris speaks to this proclaimed numbness and at the same time to sensory awareness, to the smells of rotted bodies that emerge in her sources and other inconvenient signs that crept into narratives of redemption within this genocidal culture. But it was certainly not just about how these stories were created after the war. Doris speaks too to broad tendencies and also to moments, those of the type that William Sewell Jr. calls articulations, such as in 1941, but also more broadly to the patterns of storytelling that made genocide possible. Of course, it's in the nature of a historian's work that we uncover change over time. And yet, her observation of these stories and how they operated through, quote, reversals, inversions, and absences, unquote, is how history is produced at a given moment and continuously rewritten. Chaplain Doorman's confusion in his memoir over whether a moment occurred in 1938 or 1942. Quote, building a righteous narrative about the Wehrmacht in themselves, unquote, at the time. The way that photographs operated to tell a particular story of how Chaplain Bauerle turned around soldiers' letters, effectively indicating Chaplin's irrelevance as perceived by contemporary soldiers into a story of how they instilled morality into the men and thereby created a case for their continued presence at these scenes, which they later claimed to have so abhorred, and of the type that in turn permitted soldiers to find their own actions acceptable, to go to their deaths in peace in the event. It's not surprising that chaplains focused, of course, on their own hardships or engaged in forms of inner migration. But the ramifications of such practices in the case of these chaplains helps extend, importantly, the rewriting of terms like witness and bystander in the most vital of ways. The book integrates, finally, Doris's own voice. This is not a dispassionate, removed history. We know who the players are, and we know our historian. Doris speaks to us in a voice filled with the authority of her expertise and her analytical brilliance, but also the voice of that mensch that anyone knows her, and I'm getting all chucked up thinking about Doris, and anyone who's ever met Doris or even has read her work knows so well. It's truly a treasured voice, and I feel so privileged to be part of this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Belinda. Our next speaker will be Yaniv.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you to the Anne Tenenbaum Center for Jewish Studies for the invitation, to Constance for all the logistics, and of course to Doris for having written the book and given us this occasion to meet and talk. Doris mentioned in the introduction that this book has been a long time in the making. Let me tell you, it was well worth the wait. As everything that Doris writes, this is going to be the starting point and likely the definitive starting point for many years to come. For the sake of starting our discussion, I'll make just two observations which can be grouped under two headings. One, as Belinda was mentioning, the question of integrated history, which is a question of method, but it's also an ethical question. It's also a question about ethics. And the second is the relation between ideology and theology, or between religion and violence, which I think opens up the implications of Doris's book for kind of beyond just the historical episode. So let's begin with the integrated history. I think it's a remarkable and ambitious aspect of this project. It's the insistence, as we just heard, not just to leave no stone unturned in terms of sources, but also specifically on marginalized, on the victims, on questions of gender, on questions of power, and really just with whatever sources are possible. And we'll get back to why this whatever sources are available matters. Now, this is not the first time Doris has done it. Doris has already proven us just how valuable the idea of integrated history is in her previous work, most notably in War and Genocide, a text that frankly I assign constantly to my ethics after the Holocaust class. If they need like a background reading, that's always like, just read Doris. I found the use of integrated history in that short book very moving. She always brought forth the perspective of the victims, thereby humanizing the grand narrative and reminding us that there were multiple various actors. Such an approach is always challenging, and this is doubly so in the case of the Wehrmacht chaplains. For all their differences in personalities and beliefs, they were all white, male, German Aryans who volunteered to serve as Wehrmacht chaplains. To magnify the problem, as Doris notes based on available records, we are talking about not a big number of people. And I found this fact to be quite striking. Around March 1944, throughout the entire general government, the General Gouvernement, only 10 military chaplains were responsible for about 200,000 active soldiers and 80,000 wounded. Quick math, that's about 1 in 28,000. To quote Doris, no wonder soldiers' letters rarely mention them, end quote. And if we are talking about the soldiers who rarely saw them, let alone the victims, this means that victims' account can only rarely tell the story of the chaplains themselves. But as Doris shows, such accounts can still be valuable in exposing the broader picture of violence and the knowledge of the chaplains on the mass atrocities perpetrated by the Wehrmacht. Now, I'm going to make a remark, but don't get me wrong, you should really read the entire book. However, if I had to choose just one chapter to read, I would go, or to assign to a class, I would go with chapter 4, titled Saving Christianity, Killing Jews, June-December 1941. It is what Franz Rosenzweig described as a Herzbuch. It's located not only in the middle of the narrative, but also as really one of its climaxes. This chapter captures the essence of the book, exemplifying the power both of integrated history approach, while also revealing crucial aspects of the role and self-perception of the chaplaincy. As the dates suggest, the chapter describes the start of the systematic murder with the invasion to the Soviet Union. The power of this chapter is in its insistence to draw the bigger picture by focusing on one town primarily, on the town of Zhytomyr, a town in today's Ukraine comprised primarily of Jews and Ukrainians. Doris details the mass execution of the Jewish population. According to Wendy Lower, this was the moment where the Germans crossed the line to genocide. And the story is not told only through the eyes of the perpetrators, but at the very first pages, for example, we meet Nina Gelman, a Jewish girl who was only 9 years old at the time, but managed to survive. Doris is able to show convincingly that Wehrmacht chaplains were well aware of the genocide and even wrote about it back home, sometimes as a second hand, saying soldiers are reporting that. The chaplains presented a twofold narrative of Christian redemption. First, they saw the German army as a liberating Christian force that liberates Christians from atheist, godless communism. This view was fortified also by propaganda photos, as we heard, showing German soldiers as pious, entering churches or praying in churches. So this is one vision of redemptive role that the chaplains propagated. Second, there was the idea of redemptive suffering, which was propagated even more so as soon as the Germans started encountering losses and military setbacks. Like Christ's suffering on the cross for the greater good of humanities, so the Germans suffered, according to the chaplains, in the name of a redemptive future and for a greater good. This idealized vision, Doris shows, stood in contrast with the reality in which the chaplains complained about what they called sexual promiscuity, and we can also think about the sexual violence that was involved, and it was euphemized under sexual promiscuity, drinking, and lack of interest in religion among the soldiers on the front. So on the one hand, they are writing home and it reports, this is not working, the soldiers are not listening, we are doing our best. On the other hand, they are presenting the suffering of the Germans as something vital. Now, this vision was already present during World War I or the First World War, as was the later opposition to communism. Interestingly enough, similar imperial imaginaries were present among Jewish religious leaders during the Wilhelmine Empire and all the way to the early days of Nazism. As Doris likely suspects, I have in mind none other than Rabbi Dr. Leo Beck, the official leader of German Jewry under Nazism. Beck served as an army chaplain from the start of the Great War, almost until its very end. Like the other Jewish chaplains, he was paid by the Jewish community and was in this sense not on equal footing with the Christian clergy, as much as they were later trying to present themselves, the Jewish chaplaincy, as equal to their Christian counterparts. As I show in my book, Beck initially thought of the war as conducted for the sake of the supremacy of German culture, and about the East as a vast space ripe for expansion. Even after the rise of Nazism in early 1933, Beck wrote that Judaism is in line with opposition to Bolshevism, and that, to quote, "A Jew who converts to Bolshevism is an apostate," end quote, and note here the religious language, of course. My point, to be clear, is not to equate in any way, shape, or form, but it is to ask what place do Jewish clergy visions in the pre-war era or in the pre-Nazi era can or even should play when we think about integrated history that accepts all the sources. And this question leads me directly to my second theme, which is the ideology and theology. I like to play a game with my students that is called judging a book by its cover. I know we've all been told not to. I love doing it. It also means judging a book by its title, which is what we'll do now. Let me first say, Between God and Hitler is a brilliant title. It's absolutely brilliant. It creates an immediate tension only amplified by the jacket cover, in which God and Hitler appear in kind of a larger font and on a different color. On the one hand, Between suggests a spectrum in which one positions oneself on the spectrum. And in this sense, the two terms are not opposite. On the other hand, Between God and Hitler also implies some kind of antagonistic relation, right? Like between a rock and a hard place. Doris offers the multiple, at times contradictory ways in which chaplains negotiated this relation. Some chaplains wrote critically about the impact of the war on the morality of the German soldiers, without expressing moral or religious qualms about the genocide itself. Now, we do not have exact statistics, but as far as I could understand Doris's argument, the overwhelming majority saw congruence between their service to God and Hitler. In other words, I wonder if the title should be For God and Hitler, as kind of the two are fitting together in the chaplain's perception. Now, the stakes of this are more than just the title of a book, which I recognize editors sometimes have influence. The question is the relation between Nazi ideology and Christianity. Now, Doris was, of course, at the forefront of helping us see this connection in her earlier work, Twisted Course. And in War and Genocide, she summarized Nazi ideology as concerned with race and space. Between God and Hitler offers a connection between these two books, describing the pragmatic use Nazis made of the military chaplaincy for propaganda and legitimation, while also showing how the Wehrmacht chaplaincy, which often felt sidelined and under attack, insisted on its value as a moral guarantor in ways that explicitly legitimized the Nazi regime and implicitly sanctioned the genocide. This is summarized in a favorite phrase used by the military chaplains, Gott mit uns, God is with us. Integrated history, of course, resists monocausal explanations, but I'm left wondering after finishing this book about the intertwining of religion and violence in this case. Was Christianity, as promoted by the Wehrmacht chaplains, only a handmaid of Nazi ideology? And I want to suggest two ways in which we can think about the answer to this question. And both of them are inner Christian dynamics. What was their theological training? Do we have evidence that they read Nazi theologians such as Gerhard Kittel and Immanuel Hirsch, who in their own very different ways kind of provided theological underpinning to Nazism? So did those chaplains read it? Did they reflect on it? Were they more like lay people and less kind of educated in the recent theology emerging? And a related, very interesting question is the similarities between Protestants and Catholics. To give one example, so there are a lot of similarities and Doris treats them often together, but there are also potentially important differences. And to give one example from the book, the Catholic part-time chaplain Muller was punished in 1942 for having taken Hitler's portrait off the wall before a mass. Now this, what we would consider a small act, was considered an unacceptable transgression, rising kind of in the letters all the way up, and was punished. Even this minor transgression, there is not a single parallel among the Protestant chaplains. And I wonder if this is just a matter of personalities, because this is the set of data we have, or was it something deeper about the relation of their understanding as Catholics and as Protestants. As should be clear by now, Between God and Hitler contributes to our historical knowledge of the German army and the role of religion in Nazi Germany. It also raises some disturbing questions about what can be called political religion. To quote Doris, political religion, that sacralization of a leader, a party, a cause, turns out to coexist easily with religious religion. Or to put it differently, religion is always intertwined with political, social, and familial relations, end quote. And this is an important point, made even more relevant, as Belinda was saying, when we look at the careers of those Wehrmacht chaplains after the war. Those chaplains proved very, very adaptable, utilizing a shared Christian notion to the Western occupying powers in order to position themselves as righteous, as mediators, and often breezing through the denazification process and resuming civil responsibilities as pastors. This part of the narrative really causes me to think about our Jewish-Christian dialogues today and about the implications of this type of position. And I'm thinking in particularly about the statement Dabru Emet, a Jewish statement on Christianity, which was a public call for dialogue published in 2000 by leading Jewish scholars, including our very own David Novak. One statement in Dabru Emet reads, I quote, "Nazism was not a Christian phenomenon." And it goes on to explain that although, quote, "Christian anti-Judaism and Christian violence against Jews helped Nazism take hold, Nazism itself was not an inevitable outcome of Christianity. If the Nazi extermination of the Jews had been fully successful, it would have turned its murderous rage more directly to Christians." And I was genuinely surprised after finishing reading Doris's book that this really seems to be like the apologia of the Wehrmacht chaplains, right? They were like, oh, we were also victims, and Nazism would have turned against us. Although often there was no recognition of complicity in the mass murder, the position of Christianity and the chaplains themselves as victims or potential victims was certainly a central part of their worldview. Doris's wonderful new contribution thereby confronts us not only as an important historical corrective, but also as a challenge to our understanding of religion, violence, and the memory of the past in the present. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanni. Anna Sternschus, the book.
I mean, Doris's office and my office are very close to each other, Center for Jewish Studies. So I've known Doris working on this book for quite some time. And one of the things that always amazed me is that, and she writes about this in the introduction, how she just refused to follow the voices of her sources, perpetrators. In other words, another trip to the archive, looking at another source, another idea, another voice, another country, in order to tell the story in its full complexity. Doris supervised a lot of graduate students. I see some of them here, and continues to do so. And that's the message that, that is often told to them by Doris, is that don't repeat the story that your sources tell you. And well, if one needs an example of how to do that scholarship the way it should be done, well, read that book. It's not the first time I read the book for this event. In fact, it was the second time, because the first time I read the draft was before COVID. I know it sounds like before the war. And we met in Jim's house to discuss the book. Doris asked her colleagues to read the chapter each, and help her workshop the ideas. And I remember that event, people already not shaking their hands. Everyone who came from outside was worried whether the planes would still take them back. And at that moment, we all felt that we were at a historical moment, not just because of COVID, of course, but because we were reading this piece of scholarship that really asked difficult questions and answered them in an extremely complex way. But I reread the book again before this meeting, and what I did not expect is that how, I don't know, it hit me emotionally this time, because you see, the first time I was reading this, all I was worried about was, I don't know, COVID, work, and all that stuff. Right now, we're in the midst of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, I'm thinking about this war every single day. And one of the things that come up when, we talk about what it takes for all these soldiers and officers of the Russian army to get up, abandon their everyday lives when they cared about their families, about their lives, and go and start killing people. In other words, and there's a lot of documentation about this now, how they find in bags of this Russian soldiers a poetry by Joseph Brodsky, and how they are reading intellectual things. So when I opened the book and I started reading the introduction, to me, this was the book about what it takes for intellectuals to start killing people and seeing it as a good deed. So suddenly, I was reading it as a know-how, hoping that story will have, a better ending. But, of course, it ends the way it does. And German chaplains, and Doris and I had long discussions about this because, I kept asking her, so what are these chaplains? Are these political workers? Are these culture? What are these leaders? What is their role, exactly? And suddenly I understood the book very differently. I get it. Chaplains are the ones who make it okay for people to become soldiers and to perpetrate the violence and wake up the next day and continue to do that again. And because I told you this book became emotional and personal, I'll tell you a personal story too in a second. In 1990, I still lived in Russia, and the Iron Curtain just fell. And I was, as part of my high school, we went to Germany for the first time as an exchange student. So I was placed in a house of a family of a young woman who was also 16, like I was at the time. And they had one of those houses. Downstairs was a family, upstairs were grandma and grandpa. So when I came to say hi to grandma and grandpa got very excited because he wanted to practice all the Russian swear words he learned at the Stalingrad battle. And, he went on and on and on about this. Then he asked me, where do you come from? And I forget how that happened, but somehow me being Jewish came up. And then he looked at me and said, we really have not heard Yiddish for a long time. You have to understand, I came from the Soviet Union. I grew up in a Jewish family, but it's not that I knew so much about the Holocaust or, or things like that. But I did know one thing, that Holocaust was isolated. It was very hard to see. A lot of people who, witnessed killings of Jews did not really see them because they were taking place far away. And that German veteran, in some way, confirmed that story. He went through the whole war by Stalingrad, and he still did not see. And then they invited me to go to visit his friends in the German military hospital. And at that time, I had my guitar and I was just learning Yiddish songs, and I played Tumbalalaika only because I thought Yiddish sounds just like German, so they'll understand. And this is when I, for the first time in my life, saw dead silence. They didn't know how to react to this. And I haven't thought about that episode, honestly, until I read your book now. Because at that time, I wondered, is it really possible they have not seen a single Jew when they were in the Soviet Union? Is it really possible they haven't heard Yiddish ever? And is it really possible that they forgot? So when I was reading the book, chapter by chapter, I also love chapter 4. I have special attachment to it, in fact. But, the earlier chapters and the later ones too, step by step, they explained how that happened when so many German soldiers came back home and said, actually, I haven't seen a single Jew. I haven't seen mass killings, and were able to move on with their lives. When Doris situates her narrative, she talks a lot about the context of today. The book starts with 9/11 and how that changes the view, how U.S. Army invites all these Muslim chaplains in it, and the book also ends with a German story that they invited a Jewish chaplain into the army, but we're still waiting for the Muslim one, right? Or yeah, still waiting. You know, and the context is really important, and the book would not have hit me the way it did if it wasn't. But I think there's this story of the importance of perspective, something that both of my colleagues brought up, is truly crucial. It's really important who is telling the story. Chaplains manage to turn Holocaust, as Doris writes, into a part of story of God's boundless love for his people. She quotes Agnes Adachi, a young woman who saw Germans and their Hungarian partners destroy her family and community. To her, to perpetrators, that looked like an act of God. To her, genocide, she writes, looked like a Christian priest murdering a Jewish child in front of a church. It was amazing how something that looks like paradise to some is an embodiment of hell for others, how glory turns into humiliation. The detailed analysis of where the chaplains came from is crucial for understanding the book. These are intellectuals, very well-educated people who will spend time actually learning how to console people, how to provide them comfort, how to turn, a sympathetic ear to them. So how do these people see history? And Doris is, I have to say, brutal to them. I mean, they don't get away with anything. In Poland, they don't see brutality to Poles, not even Catholics. It's not really kind of articulated and discussed in detail in their ego documents. But they call the term killing people as saving Christianity in France. Normal questions, and the book goes like this. You'll see when you read it, there are some questions that wounded soldiers ask chaplains. They say, does my life as a cripple still have a meaning? And we're almost like there with those chaplains sympathizing. Oh my God, what do you say to those soldiers? How do you respond? And those poor soldiers asking these questions. And Doris says, well, actually, that's right in the midst of the euthanasia program when they kept killing disabled people. So now, wait a second. So the chaplains are suddenly providing comfort, or maybe not providing comfort, whatever they're told to do, but completely ignoring the fact that disabled people are being systematically harassed and killed. For chaplains, Doris writes, the process of learning about German brutality, whether first or second hand, takes place at the same time as they push it out of sight and create a righteous narrative. Now, this happens, now we get to that chapter 4 of Zhytomyr, home to 30,000 Jews, right on the eve of the war. At some point, 47% of that city was populated by Jews. And Jews of Zhytomyr, those, I don't know, 2 of them or 5 of them who survived, of course, remember World War II, remember that time as the end of their community. And yet, the story that Doris brings is that how German army soldiers and chaplains among them as well remember it as a place of opening churches. And I have to say that narrative of opening churches, that narrative is still there. I mean, the idea that something had to be done about those godless Bolsheviks and Soviet citizens who did not resist this evil Stalin that conducted first, Ukrainian famine and kicked out all the Germans out of, Ukraine and put people in gulag. This idea that something had to be done against that evil was prevalent. And opening a church seemed like a proper answer to this. God is back. And Doris problematizes all that. For example, analyzing the photographs of those opening churches, she says, well, look at all these people standing in the church. None of them look too happy, like it's a gift, but who is enjoying the gift? Everyone looks like they're very stressed out looking at that opening church. So what does it mean? You know, so the church is filled with soldiers who are sitting and really stressed looking women, local women who are standing. One other thing that then that continues like this, I'll let you read that story for yourself. But one thing that struck me was this narrative of soldiers that keep asking for moral guidance from priests and asking them, for example, what will happen to me if I die? And those soldiers are terrified of death, and the chaplains are supposed to provide them with some guidance, so some counseling and stuff, and they have no problems doing that. You know what I mean? Like they tell them things. Well, whatever they say, what will give them comfort. And yet, Doris says, every day they see shootings, even if they're not personally using the gun or whatever weapon to kill people, they're doing something else. They're guarding the perimeter, they are observing, they're making order, they're putting people, in places where they should either be killing or be killed. And yet, somehow they themselves keep always asking, what will happen to me if I die? And the chaplains come up with an answer. Some of them say, well, actually, those who've been killed are not real people or they're enemies. They have to be killed for the greater good and all this. And that's kind of this banality of evil that we keep encountering in the book. But there's one point, and I don't remember if it was chapter 4, but I think it was later on page 164, when one of the moments Doris describes is that chaplains keep getting letters from soldiers' family back in Germany. And those families really want Christian burials. I mean, they say, okay, well, somebody died. We really want to know where the grave is, how they were buried and all this. And I kept reading that passage over and over again, because just now I finished working on the project on Bershut Ghetto, where 20,000 Jews from parts of Romania and Ukraine died. And one of the biggest kind of anxiety of Jews imprisoned in Bershut was that they do not get dignified death. I mean, forget the graves. Jews were buried in mass graves. Forget, Jewish commemorative prayer that accompanies death of people. People were upset that even when children lost their parents, nobody said, oh, you poor thing. There was no sympathy. And this kind of absence of sympathy, absence to reaction to death, that traumatized people for life. Some of them were not able to react to death for the rest of their lives, even if they lived till the age of 90 or 95, and they talk about those in interviews. So this discrepancy between bodies being dumped every single day and families worried about Christian burials showed once again how much the perspective matters. And then there's this episode on page 206 when Doris tells the story of a nurse who, told by a nurse interviewed by Svetlana Alexievich, about how, they dealt with some captured Germans on the field, German soldiers, and then the shooting goes on, and the nurses tell German soldiers, start digging trenches so that you can hide from all the shootings. And those men, they don't even think twice. They are sure that they're going to be shot in those mass graves, because digging trenches means digging mass graves. So much for not seeing, not notice, not being around all that shooting, because our hands are shaking. They all lost their color. And the second why the nurses tell them actually hide now in those trenches, they start crying from relief, because wait a second, they're not treated the same way as they treated Soviet civilians. And Doris then says, was either the weeping German man or a Soviet woman aware that they had just reenacted the parable of the Good Samaritan? the only like Christian reference in the book I think you will find, unless I missed some others. Anyway, the people are still fighting. The war still go on. Intellectuals is still there trying to justify violence. Some of us from distance trying to condemn it. But I think that if we know, as historians, how to deal with difficult present and difficult past, then we should look into Doris's book and get inspired from it. Thank you so much, Doris, for writing it.
So it's hard to know how to start. So I'm going to start with the most important thing, which is to say thank you. And to start thanking Jim. Thank you for the introduction, for moderating, for reading some really very rough draft chapters early on, for being part of the workshop. And thank you to Belinda, Yaniv, and Anna for your really brilliant and profound comments, all of you. And just individually and collectively, I feel like, your own thoughtfulness and brilliance has animated my work in a way that I couldn't do myself. It's so exciting to see it through your eyes. So thank you. I want to add some extra layers of thanks, Anna, for you, because as Anna pointed out at the beginning, our offices are close. We teach together. We discuss so many ideas, and your inspiration is apparent on almost every page of the book. Some really key sources, I got them from Anna. Some insights, even thinking about the bodies, encouragement, and on top of it all, she hosted this book launch. So I really owe you such an incredible debt of gratitude. I want to add special thanks to everyone at the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies, Constance Chan especially, fantastic organizing. As always, Natasha Rakiki-Fried, Galina Weissman, thank you for everything. And just looking around, so many thanks to students and colleagues and friends who contributed research. I see research assistants, numerous in the room here, who contributed through conversations, who helped me choose cover images, people who contributed funding and support. I see Tony Comper here and Elizabeth Wolf. It is, it's a really incredible to think about all of your input and friendship. So thank you. I have so much that I want to express, so I realized I have to go for some shortcuts. And I've chosen two shortcuts. The first is I'm going to use some images, the picture of the Thousand Worlds and all that. And the second, I'm going to use some cliches. One, the picture of the Thousand Worlds. Otherwise, I get too emotional. I have three cliches. I'm going to organize my comments around. The first one, better late than never. The second one, really cliche, it takes a village. And the third one, everything is connected. So let's start, if I can get the, with the better late than never. I think it's the most important thing. I worked on this book, no one said it outright, for more than 30 years. Honestly, I started it, I was a graduate student. So I think it's my most important lesson that I can share. It is better late than never. Maybe you have a book that you started, or an article, or your dissertation that you never revised for publication. It's not too late, I'm here to tell you. And it will probably be even better if you do it now than if you did it when you were supposed to do it. Why? Because you know more. Our fields are changing and developing. So I want to give some examples using these pictures. I had a contract to publish this book in 1993 with Greenwood Press, now defunct. So I went to Germany to look for photographs to illustrate my book. It's in the early 1990s, and I found a collection of photos. Several people have mentioned them. This is the first one, I'll show you them, that were labeled pastoral care to the military. And the folder was from the German military photo service. So you can see here, these were photos of the cleaning and opening of a cathedral in Zhytomyr. You heard about it? So yeah, I just translated the captions into English. So there you could see the prisoners of war cleaning the trash out of the church, more cleaning, the German soldiers watching, the soldiers going in for the religious service. I thought about putting this one on the cover, but the publisher didn't like it. And the only one that actually shows a chaplain, very, very tiny figure in the middle, the Catholic chaplain in this case, the worship service. So when I found those photos, I really just thought I would use them to illustrate. These are chaplains in action. This is the kind of thing they did. They were there, they opened the church, they preached those soldiers. Meanwhile, 20 plus years later, in the context of a conference on cultural genocide, Indigenous genocide in Canada and the Holocaust compared, super interesting. Natasha was at that conference. I returned to these photos. And now, all those years later, I had taught so many classes on the Holocaust. I understood so much more about events in Ukraine. I also had paid a lot of attention over the years to issues of gender, things that I didn't even look at the first time. The concept of cultural genocide itself turned out to be really important for me. And I had also gained a lot of experience thinking about visual images. So the photographs just took on a whole new meaning. And what really helped was I, through finding other sources of photographs, realized those events of opening those churches were not in a vacuum. That was not like some sealed off event. It was exactly part of this equation, saving Christianity, killing Jews, completely entangled. So this photograph from August 1941 of a public execution of two Jewish men, you can see their names, Wolf Kieper and Moshe Kagan, was taken in Zhytomyr the exact same week as the church opening that I showed. You look at the picture, how many German uniformed men are watching that execution? There's a whole series. This was a very well photographed event. And also, hundreds of Jewish men from the region were forced to watch that photo. There's photos, or that event, there's photos of them watching the execution. Germans took them out and shot all of them. After that, there was a wave of shootings in that region. So thinking about these events as part of the same phenomenon, as part of both erasing the Jewish presence and replacing it with a narrative of Christian rectitude, it was for me transformative. And it took me some years to figure that out. Like I just wouldn't have been able to do it at the time. So the second cliche, it takes a village, I can also illustrate, starting with the same photo, because I did not find this photograph myself. One of my then PhD students, now finished, Ryan Masters, who wrote a dissertation on German colonial violence in East Africa. He was very interested in photographs. Germans took a lot of photographs there as well in the early 20th century. He found that photograph for me. And now I know like it's quite a well-documented event, but I would never have run across that otherwise. And there's so many sources in the book, things that all of you have mentioned. I didn't find those things myself. Research assistants, friends, colleagues, many of them looking at materials in languages that I can't read or understand myself. They found interviews and images and entire collections. I was going to look around and see. Some also translated materials for me. Eli Yani, a keystone of the book, translated from Yiddish. Another of our PhD students, Michal Weinars, translated incredible materials for me from Polish and Russian that he found at Yad Vashem. An undergraduate, Sharon Manos, from Russian. There's many, many more. Also extremely valuable for me were materials that actually didn't directly connect with the 1940s. This is the perspective that Anna was mentioning. So this image, probably many of you have seen it without realizing it, It's from the inside of the dome of the Berlin Cathedral, the Protestant Cathedral in Berlin. It has like 8 panels, the Beatitudes, from the Christian Gospels. This one, Blessed are the Peacemakers, you could see, depicts a Black man killing a knight, European knight, and then, the Christ the King figure staying his hand. You can see from my label, this mosaic was put up in 1908 during the end of the Herero-Nama genocide in German Southwest Africa. And that image of literally transforming, inverting events that were going on at the time, where here you don't see the white Christian Germans killing African women, children, and men. No, you see the African depicted as the aggressor. Seeing it so blatantly in that context, it helped me understand my own context. This image was found by another of my then PhD students, Glenn Ryland, now a professor at Mount Royal University in Calgary. So the third cliche that everything is connected, maybe you already could see parts of how that works. I had so many examples, but I just decided to go with this one. I got interested in popular depictions of military chaplains, and there's tons of them, like Beetle Bailey and all that. The chaplain is usually depicted as a buffoon, right? And the idea of chaplains as both these sort of sacred figures, but somewhat pathetic, kind of irrelevant, and so on. One of the first specific popular culture representations of the Wehrmacht chaplains of World War II, is in a short novella by this man you can see here, Albrecht Goes, who wrote, published in 1950. It's called, in English, Restless Night. And it's a short story about a German Protestant chaplain in 1942, German-occupied Ukraine, Venetia. The chaplain is brought in to minister to a German soldier the night before his execution. So, the Germans killed about 25,000 of their own guys for desertion, self-mutilation, and so on. Most of them at the end of the war, but also happened. And chaplains, when they could, they spent the night before with those men. So this story is the drama of that restless night, the chaplain and the German soldier. The book was published in Germany, West Germany, 1950. It was widely acclaimed. You could see from the slide, it's been translated. Still, you can look on like Amazon, it gets great reviews. Italian, French, German, it was made into a movie in England, 1955, called Arrow to the Heart. And then the Germans made a movie in 1958, also called Unruhige Nacht, Restless Night. So it's a widely acclaimed anti-war classic taught in schools. Albrecht Goes, who's a Protestant theologian himself, won the Buber Rosenzweig Prize for Jewish-Christian cooperation. So you get the picture. This book mentions Jews in one sentence. It's on page 29. This is it, quote, "As for the pogroms against the Jews, various people beyond the circle of those directly involved knew more than they could bear." Now, Goes is usually described as a Protestant pastor, Lutheran pastor, a theologian, or a prison chaplain. In fact, I found his name in another setting. He was a military chaplain. He was a Wehrmacht chaplain, and he was stationed in various places. I found him in Greece, but also indeed in German-occupied Venetia, in Ukraine, German-occupied Ukraine. And if that place name, Venetia, is familiar to you, or you thought, like, why have I heard that name? It's probably because of this image on the left, iconic image from the Holocaust. Probably everyone has seen it, often with that caption probably put on there by the German who took the photograph, the last Jew of Venetia. I was so struck when I saw that photograph and juxtaposed it to the image on the other side, which is a still from the 1958 German movie, Restless Night. And to me, this juxtaposition, it really captures how the history of the war that you see in the photograph of the Jewish man with the German holding the gun to his head, the bodies in the mass grave, that story is transformed into a story where the drama of the war is summed up in the two Christian German men, the soldier, now not the one holding the gun, the one facing the firing squad, the savior promising God's boundless love and mercy amidst the hell of war. So that transformation, how you get from one to the other, and the role of the chaplains in it, that is what is at the heart of my book. The last thing I want to return just briefly to this image and answer a couple of the really, I think, important questions, Yaniv, that you asked. If I could almost sum them up, be something like, because you mentioned the Leo Beck, so interesting. You know, do Jewish chaplains belong in this story? Is there something specific maybe about Christianity, the Protestant Catholic ideology and theology? And I thought, like, this image, it does show that there is something specific about, like, the role of Christ, right? The figure that is both the embodiment of absolute suffering and the victor over death, that allows a certain, you could say, ease of this trading places and inversion. But other aspects, the role of legitimation, the sacralization of death, the tensions of fighting for relevance, I think those are intrinsic to the role of military chaplains. And they raise those questions about how do the institutions and the systems that we're part of, that we benefit of, shape us. So yeah, thanks.